It's time, so we have to begin.
Okay.
Welcome to the Okayama University Japan Times SDGs Virtual Global Circuit Academic Seminar organized by the Institute of Global Human Resource Development. I am Professor Okayama. I will be your host today. This webinar series covers topics related to Japanese culture or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and sometimes both. We hope the topic will appeal to the wide audience and generate discussion and new ways of thinking. Let me address some technical issues before we start. I will give you the option to unmute yourselves during the question and answer time at the end of the presentation. If you don't have a microphone, you can also use the chat function to make comments or ask questions. Please select all panelists and attendees in the drop box of your chat function so that everyone will be able to see your questions. There is also a function called Q&A. However, please don't use that one because we will only be checking the chat function. Tonight's presentation speaker is Dr. Mark Meli. Mark Meli is currently a professor at Kansai University. He has a PhD from the State University in New York at Buffalo. He has been teaching at Kansai University since 2001. At this time, let's welcome Dr. Meli.
Thank you, Dr. Kambara. It's nice to see you again, and it's nice to have a chance to talk about this. Are you going to record this? Do I need to? I don't need to record it.
No.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me, and welcome everyone. I hope we can get some good conversation going at the end. I also have a bibliography that I prepared for you, but I find that I'm not able to attach it on the chat. So I'll show you that at the end of the presentation, and you can take a screenshot if you like, or you can get back to me later and I could forward it to you. So the theme today is environmental philosophy in a comparative context. And my subtitle is Reflecting and Refracting Concepts of Nature Between Japan and the West. I'm trained in philosophy, specifically East-West comparative philosophy. And my first research focus was the way in which philosophical and aesthetic ideas from the West were learned in Japan and reformulated in order to give a theoretical interpretation of Japanese culture. My 1997 dissertation was focused on aesthetic theory, about how Japanese thinkers used concepts of European aesthetics in philosophy to describe the Japanese poetic and artistic tradition. Since 2001, as Professor Kambara said, I've been teaching in the Department of Anglo-American Cultural Studies. And for the last 12 years or so, excuse me, the focus of my teaching and research has been eco-critical cultural studies, primarily dealing with Britain, the US, and Japan. I'm American personally. My seminars cover a wide range of fields, from environmental ethics to contemporary environmental problems, to the way in which nature is represented in media and historical conceptions of nature. My students aren't specialists, so the focus tends to be rather broad. I've moved away from philosophy in my teaching, but also in my approach to research. I found the abstraction of philosophical method troubling, and wanted to include an understanding of material culture in my research as well. And this should be evident in my approach to our problem today. I've actually become somewhat suspicious of environmental ethics or philosophy that is divorced from environmental history or practical considerations. A particular interest of mine has to do with the evolving discourse surrounding the so-called Japanese view of nature, Nihon Teki Shizenkan or Nihonjin no Shizenkan. Over the past 125 years or so, there has been an ongoing discussion concerning the supposedly unique ways in which the Japanese people have historically viewed and interacted with nature, and how that is different from the ways in which other peoples have. Excuse me. The focus of the other has predominantly been the West, meaning basically Western Europe and its American and oceanic colonial extensions. Note that the West is typically seen as a homogeneous bloc in this discourse. One interesting and peculiar issue that I find here is that even though Japanology scholars around the world have come to understand the tricky nature of this discourse, its tendency for generalization, essentialist leanings, its complicity with imperialism, its selective highlighting of certain elements and obscuring of others, people outside of academic circles generally, generally widely accept this notion. I find that these ideas are rife in Japanese media and therefore uncritically accepted by most of my students and people I talk to on the street. They are repeated constantly in the tourism marketing and thus believed by most Japanese who have an interest in the country. And to connect this to another of my research interests, they're even common in the marketing of Japanese whiskey, for example, so that whiskey lovers all over the world repeat stuff about, say, Suntory's respect for nature, how the purity of its water is assured through Shinto ritual, and how the 4 seasons of Japan and the blender's harmony with them are to be credited for this superior spirit. I also write about beer, sake, and whiskey in Japan. More problematic, though, is that these ideas are often uncritically repeated in English language discourses of environmental philosophy, often by sophisticated thinkers who happen to lack scholarly knowledge of Japan and its language. This seems to me to be due to the prevalence of either Japanese scholars or non-Japanese Japan heads who are writing in English and trying to give the correct interpretation of Japan, and doing so in a way that fosters a situation wherein criticism of these ideas is equated to an unfriendly attitude towards Japan itself, and is generally considered taboo. Another problem I find with this discourse is the tendency to be divorced from the material lives of Japanese people. To give one representative example, just yesterday, I came into contact with a rather new book on the concept of Satoyama. On the back cover of this work, which proposes that the traditional Japanese style of agrarian living is an answer to some of the world's environmental problems, it states, for example, if all human beings live on the same level as an average American, more than 7 Earths will be needed. There's not a big problem with that, although actually it seems that the number's down to about 5 Earths now. But that's not the thing I want to point out. What I want to point out is this book contains essays only by Japanese authors. So why did they not tell us how many Earths would be necessary if every human lived on the same level as a Japanese person? Why point out America? It turns out that in the latest numbers from Global Footprint Network, Americans use, if everyone lived like an American, we'd have to have 5 Earths. If everyone lived like a Japanese, we'd have to have 3. So it's definitely better here. The consumption is lower. But if you compare consumption to biocapacity, that is the amount that people consume to the amount that is produced in this country, they're relatively the same. My point is not to pick about this. My point is to say, why not be a little bit self-critical here? Why point the finger at someone else? Excuse me. This is what I call the problem with the Japanese view of nature. Following William Cronin's famous article, The Problem with Wilderness, in which he argued that too much emphasis on wilderness preservation had led American environmental thinkers to ignore other and sometimes more important issues. In the same way, I believe that so much effort is being made to describe an eco-friendly Japan that is leading people to ignore or possibly even cover up more serious environmental problems. This discourse often evolves into a kind of eco-nationalism that is more concerned with praising Japan than with solving environmental problems. I've spent more than 10 years now, on and off, pursuing this issue in the hope of someday publishing a book of my own contrarian views. And I'd just like to state that this is a work in progress. It's a new formulation or extension of research that I've been carrying out over the last decade, still incomplete. And also that in the last year, as most of us, I've mostly been confined to my home, and access to libraries or to my own office has been limited. So please forgive me if I do not always have the exact references to give. I'd be happy to have follow-up contact with anyone who wants to discuss this in more detail. Okay. My specific purpose today is to show how the modern Western scientific understanding of nature, as this was interpreted by Japanese thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th century, incited them to try to outline a theory of the Japanese conception of nature in contradistinction to the Western one which was claimed to be both unique in the world and often superior to the Western notion. This was originally for domestic consumption. It was used partly to give an ideological basis for the new modern nation state, and it reached full flower in the mystical vision of the interrelated nature of the gods, the kami, the emperor, the Japanese land, and the people in Kokutai no Hongi, or the principles of our national polity in 1937. After a time, a de-imperialized version of this notion would be presented to the English world in English language texts, or to the rest of the world in English language texts, first written by Japanese scholars, and then by Westerners who had studied in Japan. It thereby came to influence European and American thinkers and environmentalists, particularly after the 1960s. As Japanese thinkers noticed how ideas from the Japanese tradition were being linked to these new environmental concepts in the West, and how popular they were among Westerners, the vocabulary of Western Western environmentalism was to some extent then reappropriated in Japan and used to reshape this discourse about the Japanese view of nature, so that this discourse would be more in line with contemporary environmentalist ideas. This has been happening over the last 30 years or so, I claim. I'll focus on 4 new tropes that have been become popular in this new discourse. So here's how I'll proceed today. My starting point is the, I think, self-evident yet somewhat controversial claim that there was no single and unified traditional Japanese view of nature. There were different ways of understanding and engaging with different environments undertaken by different groups and classes of people in Japan at different times in different places on the archipelago. So I've listed up just a few of the different ideas about nature in pre-modern Japan. On the left, these are, I call, ideas that are often mentioned in the discourse, while those on the right are often ignored in the discourse. Often mentioned, you hear people discussing the myths in the Kojiki, the Nihon Shoki, or the poetry or mythology in Manyoshu, talking about a monistic worldview wherein the gods and the land are all one. You often hear people discussing the culture of the 4 seasons in poetry and other arts. Of course, this is probably the main point of many of these discourses. And it's obvious that throughout history, at least from the 8th century, there's been this codified way of looking at the 4 seasons. It really became codified in the Kokin Wakashu and the following different imperial poetry anthologies in the Tale of Genji. And later on in the Edo period, came to really take over all the classes of Japan, so that it wasn't just among the elite, but among pretty much everyone. We also hear discussions of Buddhist non-anthropocentrism, Hongaku Shiso, the idea that all of the world is enlightened, and not just humans, but animals and plants and even stones can have Buddhahood. These are things that are often discussed in the discourse, but there are other things that are kind of different that are often ignored, such as Confucian notions of human supremacy and agency. Tessomura Suzuki discusses this in her 1998 book, Reinventing Japan. And she shows that in the Edo period, there were clear notions that humans needed to work on nature. They needed to affect nature in order to perfect it, that humans were considered higher than nature and were seen to have to work on it. This is usually ignored in the discourse I'm talking about. Also is the long tradition of Honsogaku, or natural history as it's usually translated, roaming around the land, looking for plants, animals, minerals that could be economically useful and systematically categorizing them. It's often said that Japanese are passive in response to the natural environment, but Honsogaku was very much an active way of engaging with nature. Even in Kokugaku, nativism, and in the poetics that we find, you see several notions of the superiority of human emotions compared to other beings. And in the Buddhist world as well, despite this long history of non-anthropocentric arguments, there's always been a background of anthropocentric arguments as well. If it wasn't thought that humans were special, there was no need to argue that humans are not special. So we've had these different ideas. And my point is not to say that some are true and some are false, but that some are paid more attention to than others. As I mentioned, I like to talk about environmental history and material culture as well as just ideas. And I think there's some really important things that can be said about the humans and the environment in Edo period Japan. One thing is that Japan was essentially self-sufficient at that time in food, fuel, and building materials. Okay, as everyone knows, there was a small amount of trade going on through Dejima with Dutch and Chinese traders. The majority of what was coming in at that time was Chinese medicine, cotton, and silk. So there was a problem with clothing and with medicines. But for the most part, the basic necessities of life were all provided from within the Japanese islands. In early 19th century, we had a population here of 20 to 25 million or so. Probably 85 to 90% were peasant producers of food primarily. We probably had about a 30% literacy rate. This is disputable. Somewhere 30, no more than 40, maybe a little less. There was a highway system, which when Europeans saw it, they thought it was the best highway system in the world. Of course, no cars were allowed on that, no wheels or carts. So it was in nice shape. Most people never got a chance to walk on it, of course, because travel was prohibited for most people most of the time. But it was a fine highway system and kept in good repair. And also something that's been spoken about a lot is the water systems that kept Edo supplied with fresh water, the canals that came out from the Tama River, and also the manner in which the sewage was collected in Edo. These would make for a pretty advanced system of water and sewage, and it made for supposedly a very clean city. But there are other environmental problems at the time that a lot of times we don't hear about in this discourse. And the problems I'm talking about basically come from the work of Conrad Totman and Brett Walker. It's widely known that there were many food shortages and that famines were quite common during the Edo period, sometimes very, very devastating famines. Generally small famines every 3 to 5 years and very, very problematic famines every 2 decades or so, often leading to social unrest. There simply wasn't enough food. This also connected to infanticide, which was growing throughout the period. It also connected to farmers selling their young female children into prostitution and a bunch of other, a lot of other things that caused suffering to the people. There was a shortage of fertilizer. This is seen in the necessity to actually walk, for some farmers living in Kanto, to walk 10, 20 kilometers a day, carrying other people's manure, night soil, back to their farms in order to grow things. It's also seen in the collapse of the Nishin, the herring fisheries off Hokkaido and Tohoku. Nishin herring was used as fertilizer, and they took so much of it that the fishery collapsed. There was a lack of new arable, so they'd pretty much taken up all the good land that could be used, and where a lot of marginal land was also being used. One of the problems that Walker talks about, and I think this is quite interesting, was one of the reasons for food shortage it wasn't necessarily population growth, because these famines kept growth in line. It suppressed growth. One of the problems was the growth of unessential consumer crops. There had been quite a capitalist economy growing in Japan, of course, not on the European style, but in its own style. And crops like tobacco, which was very popular, silk, which needed mulberry trees, of course, cotton, and cotton is a really needy crop. It needs a lot of fertilizer, a lot of water, a lot of attention, and tea, things like this. We're taking up a lot of the good land in Japan, land that could have been used to grow food. Topman talks a lot in his book about Japanese forestry. The lack of wood had been a persistent problem throughout Japan, Japanese history. In the Edo period, they had produced a very, very advanced forest industry. So they were producing a lot of wood, but there still was never enough. And this led to the growth of coal mining. By the late 18th century, it said that there were some 30,000 tons of coal being mined every year to be used as fuel. This led to the systematic search for economically exploitable resources, as I mentioned before, Honsogaku. Tied to this was criticism of the unproductive warrior class, also the movement into the Ryukyu Islands and to Azo, which eventually took place in the 19th century, and quite big trade deficits with the outside world. So there were a lot of different environmental problems in the late Edo period that I want to keep in mind, because when people often talk about how wonderful things were in those days and how eco-friendly it was, they rarely talk about these kind of problems. Excuse me. In conclusion to the section, I think that we can say that Japan had a deeply entrenched and very pronounced culture of the four seasons, one which by the mid-Edo period had encompassed all classes and probably all geographic areas. But that aside from that, there were various ways of both thinking about and engaging with nature in the islands. Also, we can say that a nearly self-sufficient Japan was close to being a sustainable society, but that it was kind of teetering on the edge of sustainability. And internal growth, particularly consumerist capitalism, was one of the major factors pushing it towards unsustainability. Okay, now we'll move on to number one, the influence of Western ideas of nature upon Japan. In the decades after the Meiji Restoration, we find a complete overturning of traditional society, both intellectually and materially. Intellectually, this occurred in many ways, but particularly I want to point to the importation of scientific ways of thinking. This was a new way of thinking and engaging with nature that led to a whole new kind of truth. And this really turned people's worlds upside down. And we'll look more at this in the connection of Terada Torihiko, because he really talks about this in his essay. Because this is not only shocking and disorienting, it also was immediately put to use for positive ways. One thing I just mentioned is one of the ways that science was first used in Japan immediately in the Meiji period was to investigate more into sake brewing. In order to figure out how to make sake last longer, how to get rid of off flavors, how just to make a better product. And it was immediately from about the 1890s, the sake industry was completely reformed and made much, much better products than it had before. And this is also, of course, true with agriculture and horticulture. In the Edo period, Japanese were very much involved with developing new species of flowers and trying to make better yielding crops. And once they had new scientific methods to add to their traditional methods, they did this much better. Okay, so the world was turned upside down intellectually, but also materially. Of course, people's lives were changed by the growth of industry, the growth of trade, the need to have a big military, the pollution that came from industry. And this is reflected in the growth of, say, no-hon shugi, which no-hon shugi, yes, the idea that pre-modern agriculture is the root of Japan and we need to return to an agricultural society. And I think something that I'm not going to really talk about, but I think that's interesting here is you can really compare this, I think, to the reaction of British peasants and intellectuals to the Industrial Revolution and the resulting urbanization that took place in Britain about 100 years before it came to Japan. It's only 100 years difference. And this might also explain some of the popularity of Romanticism in Japan at that time. And more needs to be done regarding this specific connection. So this discourse brings about questions, or this overturning of traditional society brings about questions about who we are as Japanese in relation to the rest of the world. And it brings about a desire for national unity, particularly on the part of the government. And both of these things are reflected in this discourse about nature. So I have just a few examples of how this, how some Japanese thinkers reacted to this this problem. There are of course many more, but I think the first thing I can find that kind of starts to talk about this is Shiga Shigetaka's Nihon Fukeiron of 1894. Shiga was trained as a geologist in the Western geology methods, and he uses these in this book. He describes the Japanese landscape and the Japanese islands geography using this new vocabulary that he had gotten from Western science. And this became a huge hit. This was a bestseller, and still in print, and people still love it, although it's much harder to read now. It's very interesting that he uses these Western ideas to describe everything, and then he comes up with the notion that, well, Japan is the most beautiful place in the world and the most varied place in the world. And he tries to prove this using science, which of course is not possible. He's mixing his value judgments with his scientific skills, but it becomes very popular anyway. And it leads to a boom of travel, domestic travel, people traveling around, trying to get more in touch with the landscape of Japan. The next work I find that kind of extends this discourse is Haga Yaichi from 1908 in his collection Kokuminsei Juron, 10 Theses on the National Character. One of these theses is the idea that Japanese love plants and delight in nature. And there's not really anything so new or interesting here. What he really does is give an explanation of the culture of the four seasons, how in every part of Japan, in every aspect of Japanese culture, you have the plants and the nature of the four seasons ruling, so that, well, Japanese food is related to the four seasons, and Japanese kimono are made to show the four seasons, and so is poetry and painting and gardens and music. He just kind of, it's kind of a list of all the ways in which nature, particularly plants, come into Japanese culture. And it's a little bit boring to read, but one of the things that I think is interesting is several places in this, he says, well, even Westerners see this, and even Westerners understand this. Even Westerners, even French people, one Frenchman said that, Japanese are all poets. And he kind of uses this idea of how we're being seen by others to back up his own ideas. Of course, very important in this discourse is Watsuji Tetsuro, his work Fudo, which he started publishing in 1929 in the journal Shiso, but then was published as a book in 1935. This is a very important work in the history of Japanese thought, really, which we can't really analyze today because there's just too much to it. One of the works that when I first read it got me interested in this whole discourse. His basic thesis is that culture everywhere is born out of the geography and climate of the land where it is, and the people's interaction with geography and climate, and that's how culture is produced. He's not the first person to talk about this, but I think at the time it was probably the most sophisticated understanding of this. He learned about some ideas in Germany, and it's well known that this idea of Fudo is Watsuji's response to Heidegger. Heidegger tried in Being and Time to analyze human being in terms of time. And Watsuji thought this was missing something because it missed the category of space. And I think Watsuji was correct. And really, if you just read it, the preface to this, the first chapter, the first 20 or 30 pages, I think it's a very sophisticated and interesting discussion that is pretty much right on spot. But then he goes on to write another 200 or 300 pages analyzing culture based on this, which turns out to be another, pretty much just a discussion of how Japan is superior to everyone else. But Terada is very much influenced by Watsuji, and his discussion, the view of nature of the Japanese, which comes out in the same year as the book version of Fudo, is really much based on Watsuji's methodology, but it's much less sophisticated. Terada is really an environmental determinist. His idea is pretty much that we have this land here, we have this geography and this climate, and we live here, and this dictates all of our life. And our culture evolves because of the landscape. And in a sense, in Terada's view, you could have no other culture than the culture you have. It's almost purely dictated by the nature that you live in. Watsuji is much more sophisticated than that. But I want to focus a little bit on Terada because I've recently translated this article into English and written a review of it. And I think it's kind of interesting, and he's really an interesting character. He was one of the first world-class scientists in Japan. So Terada was a physicist, and he was really he was a great physicist. He was on the level of anyone else at the time, pretty much. It is said that he developed his independent theory of X-rays right about the same time that Röntgen did. And Terada actually wrote this up and sent his article to Europe to be published. But it was the time that it spent on the boat that enabled Röntgen to have his works published first. I mean, there was no duplicity. It's just that the distance hurt Terada. And if he had been a little bit earlier, if he had lived a little bit closer, he may have gotten a Nobel Prize. He would have been the first Japanese to get a Nobel Prize. He was a great physicist who studied first things like X-rays, but then eventually turned to studying issues that were closer to home, like earthquakes. He spent a lot of the last decade and a half of his life working on earthquake research. But he also wrote articles about the shakuhachi, about the sound waves and how they work inside a shakuhachi, a lot of stuff about Japanese culture. Published a couple hundred articles in English, German, and Japanese on science, scientific articles, but also even more zuihitsu, kind of cultural essays in Japanese. And he was much more well known for those by the average people. He was a haijin, so he was a haiku poet, and he had studied with Natsume Soseki when he was in school, and quite an accomplished poet, I guess. What I find really interesting about Terada and this essay is he seems to be having a very big issue with his life as a scientist and his life as a Japanese. He's a great scientist, and he fully understands the power of physics to understand the phenomena of the earth. But he believes the Japanese culture is superior, and he wonders, how is it that the Westerners discovered this powerful tool of science and not us? He seems to have this kind of complex about this, and I think it's quite interesting. And the way he tries to resolve it is also, well, interesting and a bit strange. His theory in this article is that, well, there's a mother nature and a father nature. And in Japan, Mother Nature is extremely giving and extremely caring and supplies us with all of our needs. But Father Nature is also very strict and stern. And he lashes out at us with earthquakes and volcanoes and typhoon. And because of this, Japanese have basically become passive towards nature, that Mother Nature gives us all we really need. So we don't need to try to find out, look at how she operates, because whenever we try to do that, Father Nature lashes out and punishes us. On the other hand, he says that in Europe, Mother Nature is much more stingy, and Father Nature is much more slack. So that Mother Nature in Europe does not give them all the things that they need. They have to go and take it. And Father Nature, well, he doesn't punish them for taking it. So this is how Europeans have come about to try to conquer nature and try to control it. And this is why they needed to develop science to be able to survive. An interesting discussion, if you have, I think he's wrong, empirically wrong. I think you can show that a lot of this stuff is that Japanese have actually they have had to conquer and work with nature in order to feed themselves, and that no less so than say Italians and people in the south of Europe especially had a very plentiful nature. It's interesting that Haga, Watsuji, and Terada all spent time in Europe. They all spent time primarily in Germany. And I think when they write about the food or the nature or the agriculture of Europe or of the West, they seem to me to always be thinking of a German winter where it's cold and dark and there's nothing to eat but potatoes and pork. This is the feeling I get from these guys, that that's about all they saw. I'm sure they saw more, but I think these are the memories that stuck with them the most. And another reason why I think Terada's discussion is so interesting is that it's very close to the story that is told in Kokutai no Hongi 2 years later. In this book, it's actually said that the gods, the kami, and the emperor, who is the descendant of the kami, and the land and the people are all one family. So there's a kind of mystical or religious vision here. So when Terada is talking about Mother Nature, Father Nature, it's almost as if he's talking about Izanagi no Mikoto and Izanami no Mikoto, that these are actually kami who are dealing with us. Okay, just as an aside, some other influences of Western ideas about nature are written down here. Hibiya Park was opened in 1903. This was directly influenced by parks in Britain. The National Park Act in 1931, setting aside large pieces of Japan to be preserved, was influenced by American national parks. And then, of course, Walter Weston, the famous British missionary, who is well known for climbing mountains in Japan, and his book, Mountaineering in the Japanese Alps, got a lot of Japanese involved in climbing mountains as well. Okay, move on. Number 2, the Japanese view of nature spreads to the West. Now, this, of course, occurs after, well, for the most part, after World War II. Anasaki, his book is before. His book is famous for this quote, that the Japanese live too close to nature to try to control it. They see it as a friend. But I think most influential is probably D.T. Suzuki. His book, Zen in Japanese Culture, is published in 1959. Actually, this essay was first formulated about 20 years earlier than that, but it was published in the Eastern Buddhist. And so not many people saw it, I think, and most people read it in this form as it published in this book. Suzuki spends more than 100 pages of this book discussing the Japanese love of nature from various different points of view. Of course, at the bottom is a kind of Zen Buddhist discussion, but he mixes it with poetry and art and aesthetics and even Shinto. And it's honestly, this is something I first read probably in 1990 and quite loved it at the time. And now every time I read it, it just confuses me because I'm not really sure what his argument is. It's kind of just being bombarded by his different ideas. So originally you have Japanese writing in English about this idea. And then you find after the war, people like Alan Watts, Gary Snyder, who spend time in Japan, who learn the language, who actually really study Buddhism and practice Buddhism. They also start to talk about this idea. Watts in one book, Man, Woman, and Nature, and Snyder in his poetry and his writings, Mountain Rivers Without End, and various other places. This becomes influential on people who really don't have a connection to Japan. So when you move into the 1960s, which is seen as the age of ecology, the beginning of the age of ecology in the United States, after people like Rachel Carson and Silent Spring One of the very famous articles from this time is by Lynn White, who was a historian of science. And his article on the historical origins of our ecological crisis comes in 1967. And I think most people who talk about this haven't read the whole article, but basically he says that Christianity is to blame for our position today, that Christianity, for one, of course, he talks about the chapter 1 of Genesis and the idea that God has given humans dominion over the earth. And he is very critical of that. He's a Christian himself. He's a practicing Christian, but he's very critical of this. But that's only part of his argument, actually. The main thrust of his argument is that medieval Christianity saw the creation as a reflection of God, a reflection of God's mind. And they thought that the more besides reading the Bible, the other way to know God is to investigate his creation. And Lynn White's major argument is that this led people to create science, that in wanting to understand God's creation more so they could get closer to God, they developed Western science. And this is kind of ironic, right? Because this is the science that would later make God unnecessary. And in this article, and this has been quoted a lot as well, Lynn White says, well, I think that if we want to have an ecological religion, we might look to St. Francis of Assisi if we're going to stay in Christianity, because he gives us a more ecological vision, or we might look to Zen Buddhism. And this becomes quite popular. From this point on, we start hearing more and more Western environmentalists talking about Zen. There's no reason to believe that Lynn White was particularly schooled in Zen, but I'm sure he read Suzuki and maybe Snyder and some of the other people. Then you have Devlin Sessions in '85 writing about deep ecology. They spend a lot of time talking about Japanese Buddhism, Zen, also the kind of nature hermit tradition in Buddhism. And then in 1989, Caldecott and Ames put together this anthology, Nature and Asian Traditions of Thought. 3 articles about Japan in here, all of which focus on Buddhism and focus on notions of non-anthropocentrism and the direct intuition of nature, contemplating nature, simple lives, this kind of thing. Okay, the area of Western environmentalism that was most influenced by these Japanese ideas of nature was certainly deep ecology. It was primarily Zen Buddhist arguments that were taken up by them. This is only natural, as deep ecology is very much a spiritual approach to the environment, based upon philosophical notions of non-anthropocentrism and the self-realization of one's place in the ecosystem and universe. As they had rejected most of the Christian worldview, Buddhism became a religious system that could replace it for many of them. And I think Gary Snyder is seen as, they call him the poet laureate of deep ecology. So he's seen as a great example of this. It's also important to point out here that we don't see any real influence coming from Shinto arguments about nature at this time. This is because, as I will argue later, the idea that Shinto is primarily or fundamentally a religion of nature worship was not to come about until later. We also find no arguments about sustainability or biodiversity, as these were not yet common terms in environmental thought. The influence of deep ecology and of these Zen notions of nature has declined, though, in this century in the West among people outside of Asian philosophy departments. It's still kind of strong among Asian philosophers, people doing Asian philosophy. But among eco-critics and environmental thinkers as a whole, criticism by more left-leaning environmental thinkers like ecofeminists and social ecologists has led to a growing notion that deep ecology is something of an elitist and white and rather masculine view of nature that needs to be replaced by a view that is more committed to environmental justice. So I think that this change, that along with this change, the influence of Zen Buddhism in environmental thought has also been eclipsed by more recent ideas coming out of Japan. It should also be noted that while there's still Buddhist writing about nature in Japan, the popularity of Zen Buddhism in Japan here is really not that high lately. And environmentalist discussions based on Buddhism tend to be rarer, I think, than those which I'm going to talk about next. And they also tend to be far more technical and thus less accessible to the public. While a discussion of how Edo-era Japanese recycled things or how Shinto deities reside everywhere in nature is a pleasant and easy read, something like The Ecology of the Kyoto School, which came out a few years ago, is daunting to everyone. Some more recent discussions in English have moved slightly away. They've generally moved away from this Buddhist approach. Brown is very much in the Edo tradition, talking about Edo recycling. Kagawa Fox is looking at it from various viewpoints. And Kellicott and McCrae, this is an anthology with a much broader, much more diverse selection of papers than the previous one. Okay. So I'd like to come back to Japan, and I'd like to look at the new discourse about Japanese relationship to nature, and how this has been reformulated, moving away from the pre-war, the tainted idea of the pre-war, the one that was tainted by imperialism, moving towards a more environmentalist discussion. And I want to look at 4 examples, primarily. One is Shinto as a nature religion. So that Shinto is nature worship, as opposed to Christianity, which teaches humans to dominate and conquer nature. My goal is not to criticize this so much as to just point it out that it's a rather new discourse. Next is the idea of Japan as a forest civilization. It's quite well known that Japan is the second most forested developed country in the world after Finland. And in this discourse, it's often contrasted with the Western world and often with China, which are seen as civilizations of deforestation. Next is the Edo period, as the discussion of the Edo period as a paradigm of sustainable society. This is the idea of mottainai. It talks about the Edo period as a time when people would reduce, reuse, recycle, and build a fully sustainable society that was in harmony with nature. And last, and probably the most interesting and the most influential, is the discussion of Satoyama as a model of both sustainability and biodiversity. Satoyama, unlike the untouched nature of the wilderness mentality in the United States, Japan has always idealized a nature with a constant human presence, they say, where people work with the environment to create a humanized nature and a sustainable culture. This further results in a high degree of biodiversity, higher in fact than in the virgin forests that Japan's agricultural landscape replaced. So I'm going to look at each of these a little more closely. In each of these threads, we can see the influence of Western origin ecological or environmentalist tropes. For example, that the idea that religious values, particularly Christian ones, can shape people's relationship to their environment. The notion that deforestation is a major problem in many societies, and that can lead to a loss of ecological balance. The idea that waste and consumption drive environmental decline, and that sustainability and biodiversity are key concepts. Note that we didn't really hear about this in the pre-war discussion. This is all quite new. Many of the background ideas are similar, but the way of framing it is all quite new. So Shinto as nature religion, excuse me. This emerges, excuse me for the misspelling here, in the Jinja Honcho publications. And interestingly enough, it emerges in their English language publications, their websites particularly, before it does really in the Japanese publications. So there's a sense you get here that Jinja Honcho, which is of course centered at Ise Jingu, is trying to rehabilitate the image of Shinto around the world. And you see writings like Sonza Minoru, he writes in English, Shinto in the Natural Environment, that kind of bring about this idea as well. And it's become quite wide. I think if you look in the Japanese language literature, there's dozens and dozens of books that talk about this. In English, there's some as well. I mentioned here just one, well, just a couple. This Green Shinto website is actually done by a friend of mine. We tend to argue about the meaning of it, but he's a British philosopher, professor, and an environmentalist who finds really deep environmental issues, ideas in Shinto, and publicizes them on his website with a lot of photographs. Recently, a book came out by Eike Roth, who's a Dutch scholar working in Norway, that discusses this whole tradition. It's called Shinto, Nature and Ideology in Contemporary Japan. And what he discusses, I think, is interesting. He points out that he calls this the environmental religious paradigm. All right, and the point is not to say that Shinto never worshiped nature. That's not the point at all. But the point is to say that this is a new paradigm in describing what Shinto is. That no one thought of Shinto really as primarily a nature religion until probably the 1990s. I give an example. If you read The Ideals of the East by Okakura Tenshin, he mentions Shinto, and all he says is that it's simply ancestor worship, nothing about nature worship. I think this was the basic idea. But now it's hard not to think of Shinto as a kind of nature worship. Next, briefly just mention this idea of Japan as a civilization of the forest. This kind of came out of Nichibunken, where I was, not at this time, I was there later, but Umehara Takeshi and Yasuda Yoshinori started using the idea of animism to talk about Japanese religion and Japanese feeling towards nature. They claimed that all Japanese religion was kind of born of the forest, going back to the Jomon period, something that really can't be proven or disproven, and wrote about this quite a bit. I think this is connected to something we hear a lot about lately, even in English, this idea of shinrin-yoku, Japanese-style forest bathing. I first heard about this maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and I thought kind of interesting. I don't really know what's Japanese style about it except the word, because the idea of going to the forest for a kind of rehabilitation is very old in Western literature. I mean, Henry David Thoreau and John Muir talk about this in the 19th century, but now it's seen as a very Japanese thing to do, and it's seen that way by a lot of Westerners as well. The Edo period as a paradigm of sustainability. Now, I list here the English book, Asby Brown, which was written in 2009. This is what's publicized this to the rest of the world. Although Brown, in my reading Brown, I think he basically just recycled Ishikawa Eisuke. There's really no original research in Brown. I think he read these 3 books and then put it together in English. There's some very interesting stuff here, and I think these are very popular. There was a kind of boom to talk about Edo, and it relates to Jidai Geki and other kinds of culture. But there's been a lot of discussion of just how eco-friendly that society was. And I think there's some interesting points here. Ishikawa focuses a lot on recycling, on how they used their clothing until there were no threads left. That went from being a kimono to being a purse to being something to wrap something in, or then all the way down to toilet, using in the toilet or something like that. So that they used everything until it was just not usable anymore. Ishikawa also focuses a lot on the use of night soil, of human manure in forest, in farming. He's very proud of the fact that Edo was a very clean city. He thinks it was, he likes to point out that European cities were mired in their own filth, but Japan was very clean, and we were so smart that we used it to grow vegetables. Very, very chauvinistic treatment of this. And it's been pointed out by scholars in America and also in Japan, Nagai Yoshiro in Japan, that this is a little bit idealistic. That the notion that, well, I think what you find in this in Ishikawa is praising people for doing what was necessary. like I mentioned, there wasn't a lot of food in the Edo period, and people were using manure not because it was eco-friendly, but because they couldn't grow crops without it. And Nagai, in his book, Edo no Fun Yogaku, and also Honto wa Braku no Edo Jidai, gives a little more interesting discussion of these things. For example, all the parasites that were in people who were doing this kind of stuff and how unhealthy it was, actually. But Asby Brown writes about it in English and pays no attention to any of the issues except how great it was. Lastly, maybe most importantly, the idea of Satoyama as a model of sustainability and biodiversity. Excuse me. I'm sure many people are aware of the NHK documentaries, which were then translated into English and well, they're not just translated, they were redone in English. So Satoyama came out in the 90s, the NHK versions. And then in 2005, the BBC redid this. They actually changed some of the video, and there's a completely new narration by Sir Richard Attenborough, and aimed at the outside of Japan. And it's very interesting to compare the two and to see how they differ. I've written an essay about this that I published at Kansai about 10 years ago. Of course, Mogami Kosuke, very famous for his Satoyama Shihon Shugi, which has brought out, has got a lot of, it's been read by many, many people and been quite influential around Japan. And a new book came out on this from him again very recently. And then I mentioned before Murasawa's one-year-old book on Satoyama studies in English. And this is centered in Ryukoku Daigaku here. I haven't been able to get my hands on it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading this. So these four, I think these are the four main tropes that are related to this discourse now. Buddhism is kind of faded a bit. And we see these four discussions. What can we say about that? Well, we can give some positive notes that they're all quite inspiring and quite beautiful. They all speak of ideal ways of living and thinking that we might aim for, and usually accompanied by visual imagery as well. Green forests around Shinto shrines, the Chinju no Mori, beautiful mountains and gardens, ancient Japanese architecture, whether it's shrines or old farmhouses, paddy fields and agricultural landscapes. If you watch the BBC documentaries, they're beautifully filmed. Thinking about this makes us all want to be closer to nature and makes us more friendly to the environment. So I think there is a kind of inspiration here. And this is important. This is important, I think, because, when I talk to my students about environmental problems, unlike in the United States, Japanese students don't argue against the anthropogenic nature of climate change. They accept this, but they lack inspiration to do anything about it. And I think this is true everywhere, not just here. So we do need inspiration in order to attack environmental issues. And some of these can give that, but I find some problems with it as well. There's some practical advice here, and I'll come to this in the end, but I think there's also room for a lot of criticism of these as well. And the first point of criticism, I'm going to give two. The first point is that each one of these cherry picks the facts and evidence that it wants to include while ignoring other evidence that's inconvenient for it. So, for example, when we talk about Shinto as nature worship, as I mentioned before, it was for the long time mostly seen as ancestor worship or emperor worship. And furthermore, has never had anything to say about nature outside of Japan. I like to say that Shinto is not nature worship, but worship of Japan. So how, I think this is a problem. It leaves that out. Regarding forests, and this is a rather easy one, I think, Japan has experienced long periods of deforestation in the past. And even though that was solved in the Edo period, today, we all know the problem of the shokurin, that, no one is taking care of the forest here now, that has too many trees that are unhealthy. And that's why everyone's suffering from sugi allergies now. Regarding the Edo period, as I mentioned before, it wasn't nearly sustainable. but it also came with a high degree of suffering for the people, for peasants, and especially for women and children. And we might ask, is that something we really want to go back to? Is that something we find acceptable? Regarding Satoyama, for one, this kind of sustainable agrarian living is not uniquely Japanese at all. The term is Japanese, but it's occurred all around the world. And it hasn't really been practiced in Japan for a long time. Most of the discourse has been used to promote tourism. So we have this way of picking the things we like and leaving out the things that are inconvenient. But I'll give another criticism, which I think is maybe even stronger. And that is that nearly all this discourse throughout all four of these tropes, even the parts that seem as if they might have an interesting environmentalist contribution to make, they're often proclaimed not in an ecological spirit that actually attempts to come to grips with the present situation and improve it. Instead, they're almost always proclaimed in a chauvinistic manner and a nationalistic manner, patting Japan on the back for being so very eco-friendly and blaming others for the world's problems. And I find this to be really a lack of seriousness, a lack of ecological seriousness. For example, in the discussion of Edo, it seems clear to me that there are practices that people took part in back then that would be useful today. And this idea of mottainai certainly is important. Everyone agrees with that, but it doesn't change the way they behave. What can we say about the Edo period and the practices of that time that would have an effect today? This is not so clear, and no one's really thinking about this, at least none of those people who've written the books I mentioned. You know, these things were done in a time where people were poor and where there was much necessity. And most of these, you know, ecologically friendly behaviors came out of necessity. So in a country today, in a world today where we don't have that necessity, where we have everything we need, why should we behave like the people behaved in Edo period? I'd like to hear that argument, but I don't see that people are making it. Regarding Satoyama, I think this has more to say to us. I find it personally compelling. I'm a gardener myself. Nothing near self-sufficient, of course. And I think there's a lot of good ideas coming out of this Satoyama capitalism discussion. Although reading through Mogami's work, excuse me, not Mogami. Yeah, Mogami's work. It's really not environmentalist. It's really talking more about Japanese economy and how the rural economy in Japan can become more independent, can move away from money, can really, how people living in the countryside can use the resources around them to sustain themselves, not needing a lot of money, and how that they can enjoy this nature and they can have a healthier and happier life with less money, and you know, how this will lead them to have more children and stuff like that. You know, he's not talking about the environment, and I think you could though, and I really wish that someone would, and maybe I'll think about this more in the future. I think that linking these ideas of Satoyama and Satoyama capitalism directly to environmental steps, not just saying, oh, well, isn't it great that Japanese were so sustainable in the past, but actually looking forward and how this might give us real advice is an interesting step. But I haven't seen it done yet. Okay, so we'll move on to just conclusions, which I mostly already said, but I'll just reiterate these. It's been within the intellectual interaction and comparison with modern Western society that the idea of a Japanese view of nature has been created, always as an antithesis of the perceived contemporary Western view. My point is here that before this thesis, antithesis thing started in the Meiji period, no one ever talked about the Japanese view of nature. And it's not at all clear that anyone really gave it much thought. But it has emerged as an antithesis of Western science. After the war, it kind of shifted. And for a while, Japanese people stopped talking about this because it had kind of been discredited. But it moved to it kind of flipped over, where Westerners were looking at Japan and saying, wow, this is really cool. And I don't talk that much about this because it's really not my field, but I think it's important to think that, in the 1960s, anti-authoritarian feelings among young people were highly linked to the environmental movement that was starting then, and rejection of capitalism, rejection of Christianity, rejection of all the things that people didn't like about Western society, about racism and imperialism and the war in Vietnam, led them to look abroad. And I think that these are some of the ideas that people grabbed onto, not just environmentalism. Of course, you see a big growth in mysticism and Eastern mysticism, Eastern philosophies from this point as well. And how much did they influence environmental thought in the West? I don't know. This is up in the air. We can question that. So these kind of uplifting, aestheticized and spiritualized images have been favored when we talk about this, but these kind of aesthetic images or spiritualized images have been favored more than the dirtier or the practical images, okay, of how people really actually grappled with the natural world, which they did. It's not like Japanese said, it's just we're fed by nature. Just the act of making a rice paddy is an amazing way of changing the environment. Okay, so the vast majority of this new wave of nature theorizing Japan, I think, is more about cultural nationalism and chauvinism than it is about environmentalism. There are likely environmental practices and ideas that can be mined from Japan's past and tradition. I believe there are, but we should ask, and this is the task from now on, what do these tell us about how to actually solve our present problems, including the problems that are within and are actually caused by Japanese society? Okay, that's it. Let me just, I'll stop this and I'll put up my bibliography. So if anyone is interested in seeing that, you can take a screenshot. Kambara Sensei, can you see the bibliography?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I grouped it just into general works, and this is all English language stuff. General works talking about this idea, works about pre-modern Japan, works discussing the reaction to the West in the pre-war period, and then some Western discussions of this, or including Suzuki and Anisake, and then some more recent stuff. Well, thank you all for listening. I think this may have been provocative. I don't know. I gave a lecture about this to a bunch of philosophers once in Japanese, and there was almost a fight breaking out because people disagreed so vehemently with my position. I'm not looking to start a fight, and I'm not looking to be anti-Japan in any way, but it's often taken that way. And I've decided not to do this in Japanese anymore because it's a little bit too hard to make my points perfectly. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to field them. If you have any comments, if you want to discuss any of this over our chat function here, or my email address is here on the bibliography as well. If you wanted to get in touch with me through that, I'll be welcome to that as well.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. We'd like to take questions and comments from audience. Please unmute yourself. Any other question or comment? Okay, I think we should finish today's seminar. Thank you very much, Dr. Meli. It was really interesting and provocative presentation. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you all for listening. If you want to get in touch with me with any comments, please feel free. Nobuyuki, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.